Good afternoon, and welcome to Making the Case with Dr. Akande. I'm Dr. Yemi Akande, and each week on the program, we'll bring you conversations with established and emerging leaders from a broad range of organizations as they offer their views on pressing local, national, and international issues that impact Northeast Ohio. Welcome to Making the Case with Yemi Akande. My guest today is none other than Daveed Gartenstein-Ross. He's the author of Bin Laden's Legacy and has been described as a well-known counterterrorism expert by Congressional Quarterly researcher. He's made both academic and practical contributions to the field. Bin Laden's Legacy, for those of you who have read it and those of you who are yet to pick it up, is Mr. Gartenstein-Ross's new book, and it reviews the first 10 years of the U.S.'s war on terror. And we'll be talking a little bit about that later on, but welcome to my show.
Yemi, thank you. It's an honor to join you.
Yes, and I'm really fascinated just by your background in terms of how did you even get started or go about getting into this line of work? So it's kind of a little rewind on the history of you.
Well, it was a bit of a circuitous route, and one that is the topic actually of my first book. Back in the late 1990s in college, I'd actually converted to Islam and practiced a very moderate form of the faith, and ended up getting involved in this extremist Wahhabi charity in my hometown of Ashland, Oregon, which ended up being a specially designated global terrorist entity. Like I said, this was the 1990s, prior to the 9/11 attacks.
Right.
And in that environment, thought a lot about the case for Islamic extremism, for some time adopted somewhat extreme ideas of my own before ultimately rejecting them. And so I'd gotten to see this world from the other side of the fence. Now, that in itself didn't really, in my view, didn't really build an expertise or anything. But what it did was it gave me a different, it gave me, first of all, an interest that would end up lasting well into my adult life in this subject matter and a passion for it. Yes. And also it gave me an interesting view in, an interesting perspective in, one that a lot of people in my field are never afforded.
Why do you think that is the case?
First of all, I think that the counterterrorism field, that's what I refer to as in my field, is one where people tend not to be particularly religious. As such, I think they have difficulty understanding the power of religious ideas. But beyond that, working for a terrorist group is just not a straight-up path, nor is it one that I would recommend people who are aspiring to enter the field. But it was something that was an interesting early life experience that helped to shape my own perspectives and my own passion and understanding within this field. You mentioned there, just in passing, and I know as you also noted, this was one of the focus of your first book. What was the impetus, so to speak, for your religious conversion? And are you still religious? I'm still religious. I do not practice Islam. But the impetus was, this was a conversion that came when I was young, when I was 21. I'd had a couple of brushes with death due to illness, one at the end of high school, one in college within a 2-year span. The kind of experience that often makes one think about deeper religious questions. I'd been raised spiritual, but not particularly religious, not within a formalized religious tradition. And to me, actually, Jesus had always been a very strong, compelling religious figure. Right. To me, as I learned about Islam in college, and in particular through one of the more mystical strands of the faith, Sufism, it had a conception of Jesus and a conception of God that augured with what I naturally believed, with what I naturally believed Jesus to be in terms of his relationship with God. It had a unitary view of God, and felt very comforting to me. Ultimately, as I came to adopt more extreme views within the faith, my idea of what religion was would shift from kind of this westernized conception in which religion is something that makes us feel comfortable to a different conception, the one that I hold today, which is that religion isn't about comfort, rather religion is about divine revelation. It's about forging a relationship with God that's based on God's truth. And that's something that can lead one to extreme or non-extreme views.
Correct.
But I think that the split between those two views is very important because often Westerners conceptualize religion as being akin to philosophy. Correct. And it really, for most people, it isn't that. Mm-hmm. For most people, it's something deeper and also something that is less malleable. Correct. Than what we in the West think of as religion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Since we're talking about religion, let's talk about religion within the context of terrorism. You know, a lot of people are interested in that, and I think there are multiple interpretations to what role, if any, does religion play in terrorism and the jihad. Could you elaborate on that and explain that to us?
Yeah, as you said, it's a tremendous debate. With some people arguing that religion essentially plays no role. Mm-hmm. For example, Robert Pape's academic work, which argues that what suicide bombing is all about is occupation by democratic powers, mm-hmm. That it's a strategic decision. To the extent that religion is relevant, it's basically relevant within the context of national resistance. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you have another book, Refuting Pape by Asaf Magadim, which argues that, on the contrary, the ideology of transnational Salafi jihadism is a dominant factor in spurring the new wave of suicide bombings. Mm-hmm. In my own work, I've tended to find that religion is an important factor. And I'm not going to say it's the most important factor. But I've done extensive empirical work mm-hmm. Looking at the role of religion, looking at basically broad cross-sections within the U.S. and UK of people who've become jihadi terrorists. Mm-hmm. And there are certain overt behavioral changes one can pick up within mm-hmm. this sample, which indicates a developing view of religion. Because behavioral changes would include, for example, adopting overtly a legalistic understanding of Islam, down to the minutest details of their life being controlled by the ideology that they're coming to adopt. Mm-hmm. Seeing practices of religion which they think of as being less pure, as a personal affront, taking personal offense when people don't agree with their understanding of faith, trying to enforce the religious views on others. For example, the Walters brothers in the Netherlands prohibited their own mother from drinking alcohol or watching television, both of which were antithetical to their very austere view of Islam, coming to trust only a certain set of Salafi jihadi scholars as holding the one true interpretation of faith. Mm-hmm. These are all external manifestations that indicate that for this set, religion is much more than a thin pretext. It's something which is deeply felt and has tremendous ramifications for how they live their lives.
Mm. Some people may say that, there's almost a psychological, perhaps mental shift that happens for individuals that some individuals may believe are somewhat to the far left in terms of their interpretation of religion in particular in that realm. What do you have to say about that? Do you think there's a psychological, mental factor there, that the intensity is increased?
I think that there certainly is in some cases. Okay. Whether that's something which is in the majority of cases is more difficult to say. I mean, there are certain things that are difficult to measure. Correct. And I try to keep my work as empirically based as possible. I mean, I have my own interpretations of what it means. Sure. But it's always dangerous to assume a certain leap. And what you say there makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's intuitive, and it's something which in certain cases one can discern.
But it's not empirical or has been tested yet.
I certainly just haven't tested it to my satisfaction.
Okay. So now in relation to your book, let's changing gears a bit and talk a little bit about your book. What has changed for the U.S. since 9/11? For the good, the bad, and I would venture to add, it begs even the ugly.
The basic thrust of my book is that we haven't been for the past decade fighting the war that we thought we were fighting. To us, this war with Al-Qaeda was about preventing another terrorist attack. Mm-hmm. And to Al-Qaeda, their focus was different. My argument is that they were focused on the U.S. economy. And I wouldn't argue, and very few people would, that the economic woes we are facing today are entirely attributable to Al-Qaeda.
You would or you would not?
I would not.
Okay.
Would not.
Okay.
I mean, there are multiple other factors, many of which I think are more important to the economy.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda did not cause the subprime mortgage crisis.
No, they did not.
Al-Qaeda is not responsible for our health care costs. Al-Qaeda did not, for the most part, cause the rising price of oil. I mean, they did actually contribute somewhat
to it.
But only a very small percentage of the rising price of oil could be attributed to Al-Qaeda. That being said, if you're formulating strategy, you look at your enemy's structural weaknesses. And the fact that we had multiple other problems eating away at our economy doesn't mean that Al-Qaeda and the war against them hasn't been a problem. It certainly has. So in the book, what I outline is that but there's a central metaphor, which I got from a political science journal that was published a few months before the 9/11 attacks. And that metaphor is George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. Okay. Their very famous 1974 boxing match, in which George Foreman was the heavily favored fighter. He was the strongest, most powerful fighter of his generation, and expected to beat Ali rather easily. Right. And Muhammad Ali, rather than going to the center of the ring, ended up cowering against the ropes, sometimes whispering hoarse taunts against George Foreman. And Foreman unleashed a flurry of blows. And to everyone, with Ali up against the ropes and Foreman punching away, it seemed as though Muhammad Ali would inevitably fall. But in fact, the elastic ring ropes were absorbing the majority of the blows. By the fifth round, Foreman was exhausted. By the eighth round, Ali knocked him out to pull off a stunning upset. And this article, called How the Weak Win Wars, argues that this is how a small and relatively weak actor can defeat a superpower like the United States, by turning its strength against us. And my argument is that for much of the past decade, the United States has allowed its strength to be used as a weapon against it. In other words, the harder it hits, the more exhausted it becomes. Now, the implication is, of course, not to do nothing, but I argue that there are systemic flaws in many of the approaches that we've adopted to this particular problem.
Is that, would you say those are, strategic defects?
Yes, absolutely, strategic defects.
Who's to blame for that? Who would we possibly say fell asleep on the job?
Well, the individuals responsible for each portion of that puzzle who got it wrong are responsible. One could trace responsibility to certain actors, in particular within the Bush administration. I think the war in Iraq was incredibly costly. But there was more of a widespread breakdown on this issue. I mean, a lot of people who I'd say shoulder some of the blame, in my view, are quite sympathetic. I mean, there was really a tremendous view within government that the next shoe could drop at any moment, that you could wake up and there could be another 9/11 on your hands. There's a lot of scrambling to keep the country safe. And in this context, a lot of the strategic work in understanding the enemy that should have been done didn't get done. And one understands why you prioritize the immediate rather than the longer academic study of what is it that our adversary wants, what are its ways and means to pursue its goals. Right. But that still is work that needs to get done, particularly if you're fighting a different war than the enemy is fighting. You need to understand the war that your enemy is fighting. So, I mean, I think there are certain actors who shoulder the blame, but I think that beyond just individuals, there really was a systemic breakdown in this way.
And what is your read on how Obama's administration is handling the matter?
It's hard to say. I mean, there are some ways in which the administration, in my view, has been positive. There are some ways where it has been not so positive.
Okay. Can you elaborate?
Yes. In terms of the not so positive first, okay. I think that some of their linguistic choices, that it makes sense with respect to public diplomacy, in other ways hamper our analysis of the problem that we face. Okay. The administration has been dedicated to not using words like Islam, jihad, etc., when describing this enemy. And I understand it as a matter of public diplomacy.
Right.
But I think that you really do need to have a good granular view of your enemy. The ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu quite famously said, "Know your enemy and know yourself." And I do think that the linguistic choices that we're making, again, while understandable in terms of public diplomacy, end up seeping into our analysis as well, and in that way harming our analytic understanding of the foe. I also think that, as with Bush, the Obama administration, has often had, it seems to at times have a bit too much in the way of politics in mind when looking at this. And one area that right now is quite very much in the news is hastening a withdrawal from Afghanistan in order to score points for the election.
Correct.
Now, Afghanistan is, of course, there's a morass of problems, and I'm not saying that one shouldn't hasten a withdrawal for other reasons, but for political reasons is a bad reason to do so. And I say that the Bush administration did similar things because in the 2002 elections, one of the things that it gained from very much politically was the coming war in Iraq, which at the time was very popular and helped sweep the Republicans to a 2002 midterm. So both parties to some degree, and it happened much more with the Republicans in part because terrorism was a bigger issue in 2002, 2004 than it would be subsequently. But both parties have played politics, which has been something which has not been positive.
I think I was reading in the news recently being a couple of days ago, that some CIA operatives in Afghanistan were picked up, and right now they are presumed dead because Afghanistan has a very low tolerance in terms of when CIA and the like operatives are captured. And some individuals have attributed what has happened to a lack of imagination even on the CIA's part with respect to security and counterintelligence. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it was actually Lebanon where they ended up getting picked up rather than Afghanistan. You had Hezbollah. It seems that you had Hezbollah counterintelligence actually find out the individuals involved who were not CIA officers themselves, but rather CIA informants. Essentially, what they found was that these individuals were meeting their handlers at a Pizza Hut. They were using code words. They were using cell phones that would, where there was a repeated pattern. Cell phones not used for any calls except to limited numbers, and they were all very short calls, setting up the meeting, and in that way ended up monitoring and then sweeping up these informants, these people who were being used as on-the-ground spies by the CIA. Reading the initial accounts, it certainly seems like the field work that was being done there was incredibly sloppy. One from newspaper articles can see how they were doing their jobs, and it seems like they were setting patterns which a good counterintelligence service could end up deciphering, and in that way picking up the informants. Now, often initial reports of any subject prove not to be correct. So bear in mind that it might be that the story is a little bit different than what's come out so far. But it certainly does seem to be poor field work within the CIA.
So are we becoming, when I say we, I mean the collective USA, becoming a little bit soft on how we even approach such counterintelligence work? Or this is just an anomaly?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the intelligence work, the actual human intelligence process is not one that I have a great deal of exposure to or visibility on. I have more visibility about our analytic process, which is also an area where I think that there's room for improvement, although I do know some very excellent analysts within government who I think do a remarkable job in their work. But, with respect to human intelligence, that's something which has been pinpointed as a weakness for the United States 10 years ago when 9/11 occurred. It's often said that we need to improve our human intelligence because we're so reliant upon what's called SIGINT, or signals intelligence. We're great in terms of getting electronic signals on any set of problems,
right.
but we have much more difficulty having people on the ground actually penetrating terrorist organizations. It's difficult to say whether this is an anomaly that can be attributed to certain operatives who let their guard down, or whether we have a much bigger problem on our hands throughout the intelligence community.
I guess time will tell.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about public awareness. What would you say the public gets or does not get with respect to what's going on in the Middle East?
That's a great question. I think that in general, public perception is not. The public is not that doesn't have a great understanding, and in part, it's an entirely different cultural context, and culture matters. I think that the area in which the public most misunderstands, not just the Middle East, but any part of the world, is looking at that part of the world through their own cultural lens and their own cultural biases. So, for example, we talked a little bit about the role of religion and this view that religion really doesn't matter. And as I said, that's not a view that I have. I think that religion does matter. To me, one of the major things that is dominating the view that religion doesn't matter is a bit of projection. And a lot of the analysts are people to whom religion doesn't matter. And, to the extent that they or their associates invoke religion, it really is just a pretext, a kind of a thin veil of justification. And so they take that paradigm and they apply it to this other problem set half a world away. Now, that's a dangerous thing to do because when you get to the specific cultural context, the world can look very, very different. I think that when the public writ large attempts to understand the Middle East, it's a very alien world with respect to their own worldview. Now, some things people can grasp, right? You can see, for example, the Arab Spring, and people naturally understand a struggle against dictatorship and the desire for freedom. That's something which they can understand. That's something which cuts across cultures. But for a lot of issues, from what motivates terrorist groups to life on the ground in many countries in the region, it's a difficult thing to grasp if one hasn't been there or, at the very least, significantly studied the area and these phenomena.
So what role or how can the public begin to even wrap their head around it without making these leaps in judgment?
Well, it's a great question. Rather than talk about the public writ large, I think I'm more interested in individuals who want to inform themselves. Because there's almost an infinite number of things in the world that are important that the public doesn't understand well. Right now, I'd say probably the most important thing is not the Middle East, but rather economics. Given the state of our economy, I think educating the public about economics would be a more important thing than the little niche which I inhabit. But for people who want to gain a greater understanding, I think a good place to start is always getting out of newspapers and reading books. And there are very good books about multiple aspects of this problem, whether it's terrorism, whether it's the Middle East writ large, whether it's just understanding the Islamic faith better, whether it's specific countries. There's a wealth of very good and also a wealth of not so good material out there. And the second thing is talking to people from the region, visiting the region. There's no better way of getting experience with a certain area than actually going there. One difficulty, of course, is that many of those areas that are most important to U.S. interests now are increasingly difficult to visit, whether it's Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan. Physical danger does loom large in a lot of these areas if you're an American visiting there.
Correct. When was the last time you were back in some of those places that you mentioned just now? How often do you get back there to practice your language or immerse yourself in Arabic?
I visit as frequently as I can. This year has been a fairly slow year for travel for me. I've only been out of the country a couple of times, and going back to Europe, actually, rather than the Middle East in December. But in past years, I've been able to travel much more, and I plan on going to Afghanistan next in March.
So what keeps you excited and passionate about your research and this line of work? What keeps you going, so to speak?
The main thing is that I feel like what I'm doing matters. It's a field where lives are literally at stake, and to me, if I can make a difference in some small or large way, that definitely keeps me going. I like challenges, and I like being able to make something of a difference. When I see something in the news that angers or excites or worries me, being able to write about it, interface with policymakers, try to come up with solutions is something which I feel very privileged to be able to do.
And if you weren't doing this, what would you be doing?
It's a good question and hard to say.
Okay.
My wife and I were just on vacation together, and I was speculating that maybe I'd be a private investigator, which is an idea that she kind of shot down.
Yeah. Oh, really?
She thought it wouldn't keep me interested.
Oh, okay.
I mean, generally, you're kind of spying on cheating spouses.
Exactly. It's more individual.
Which is not that interesting.
Exactly. You're looking for the kind of the big pie, so to speak, countries and cultures and what's going on. I think I'll be remiss in not asking you to talk a little bit about martyrdom and the new jihad terrorism. What does that mean? We hear that thrown around a lot and inserted into news stories. What, if any, is the appeal?
Of martyrdom specifically?
Yes.
Well, one could look at it in multiple levels, and people do. I mean, on the one hand, one can look at it as merely as a symbol. Martyrdom is by no means unique to Muslims, to jihadists by any means. You had in early Christendom, you had many Christian martyrs. Now, they weren't killing people; they were being killed, but they were dying for their faith.
Correct.
You had in Vietnam, bunks setting themselves on fire during the Vietnam War. That was something which caught a lot of public attention.
Right.
In fact, it was a street vendor setting himself on fire that kicked off the revolution in Tunisia. Again, not killing themselves, but dying as martyrs. Now, suicide bombing is something that has been used by other groups. LTTE, which was the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, prominently used the tactic as well. There's symbol to it that we're willing to die because we feel so strongly. A second level, there is a strategic purpose to it, that suicide bombings are very difficult to defend against. If you set a bomb remotely, maybe you'll hit your target, maybe you won't. If you walk it there yourself and have the bomb on you, you'll die.
Yes.
But it's much more difficult to defend against a person who's willing to die. And then a third level is the religious level, that the idea of martyrdom is something which is inscribed within Islamic texts. Now, there are, one can break down the theology of this in a great deal, but and there are some who argue that suicide bombings, because they are suicide, are actually religiously prescribed. But people who take part in it believe that this is a ticket to heaven, and that dying in battle is one of the few ways they can ensure themselves to reach heaven. There are all those various levels of appeal, and different authors, depending upon their perspective, will emphasize, the symbolic, the strategic, or the religious aspects of it.
Okay. I think I'm coming up on my final 2 questions, I would add. Let's fast forward to 50 to 100 years from now. How would you like to be remembered?
That's a great question, and one which I couldn't possibly answer honestly, in the sense that it'll be whatever I end up being remembered for is still very much in my future. I'm someone who's always had kind of strong ambitions. So I think that really whatever I could say I would actually want to be remembered for would be far too
limiting, perhaps,
or either far too limiting or far too egotistical to. But just being very bluntly honest to ever want to say it on air.
Okay. And humble, too, I might add. The subtitle of your book is Bin Laden's Legacy, Why We're Still Losing the War on Terror. Do you think perhaps in the near or far future that there'll be a part 2 to that, Bin Laden's Legacy, Why We're Winning the War on Terror?
I would hope at some point that if it isn't me, then someone else will be able to write how we turn things around. And look, this is the field that I'm in.
Right.
It's not a field I'm antagonistic towards. So I certainly hope that we end up beating this adversary. And I believe that we can. I believe that we can. We certainly have actually made improvements over the past decade. If I were actually to be able to choose the title for my book today, it wouldn't be Why We're Still Losing the War on Terror, but rather it would be how Al-Qaeda managed to turn the U.S.'s strength into a weapon against it. Because that's much more of what I'm talking about.
Right.
The focus is not really on where we are this very moment. Rather, it is how did we get to where we are 10 years in? And so the focus on my subtitle of We're Losing, though it's a provocative subtitle, so I understand the focus on it.
Right.
But I think the book is much broader.
Right.
The book is really how did we get here, and how can we pick a better course forward?
Okay. Well, if you have not had the chance to pick up the book, I certainly recommend that you do so. It's titled again, Bin Laden's Legacy, While We're Still Losing the War on Terror, and it's written by Daveed Gartenstein-Ross. It looks like that's all the time we have for today on Making the Case. I want to thank my guest, author David Gartenstein-Ross, for joining me on Making the Case. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yemi. It was an honor to join you.
Yes. If you have questions or comments about today's program, please email them to mtc88.7@gmail.com.
Making the Case with Dr. Akande is produced with the support of WJCU in University Heights, Ohio. Our theme music is by Alexander May. I'm your host and executive producer, Dr. Yemi Akande, inviting you to tune in next week at the same time for another edition of Making the Case.